Our first speaker is from Salt Lake City, Utah, and he was named one of Utah's most politically influential people by the Salt Lake City Tribune. He's the founder and the president of Libertas Institute, but you might recognize him as the author of The Tuttle Twins, a series of over 30 books focused on introducing young readers to economic, political, and civil principles. So will you join me in welcoming Connor Boyack to the stage?
Good morning, everyone. How you doing? Oh, good energy for 8 a.m. Someone got their caffeine. I'm a wanderer, so I'm gonna move around the stage. I can't be glued to a podium. I really struggle if I just stand here the whole time. For those of you who missed the VIP event last night, you really missed out. Stacia shared a very personal story of hers and her husband struggling with COVID and the ability for her to even visit her sick husband in the hospital, and just the absolute tyranny it was to intervene in that familial marital relationship and deprive them of human contact. I was reminded as she was sharing that story of my wife's grandma. She was one of the many who were in a old folks home, and we'd have to bring the kids to the parking lot and just, wave at her from the parking lot through the window as she kind of pressed up against the window. And I would always think to myself, what's the point of life if you can't live? It was a big struggle. My father-in-law had open heart surgery right as COVID began. He had a heart transplant. He's been quarantined for 2 years. He had to take immunosuppressants, anti-rejection meds to make sure that his body could actually, retain the heart. Consequently, he didn't have any antibodies, and his doctors said, don't be around anyone. More particularly, they said, don't be around any unvaccinated people. And so they've hung out with their children and their families who were vaccinated, despite those vaccinated families getting COVID and exposing the dad to COVID. Meanwhile, my wife and our family, who is unvaccinated, have not been able to visit with him for 2 years until Thanksgiving a week ago when he finally got brave and came to the home, mask on and everything. COVID has really presented for us, I think, an awakening. A lot of us in this room, I think, were probably woken up during or as a result of COVID. And realizing that we live in a totally different society than the one we had before. I have one metric that may give a little indication of that. As Stacia mentioned in the intro, I write the Tuttle Twins books. We've sold millions of copies teaching kids about the ideas of freedom. And in the first 6 years of publishing these books, from 2014 to 2019, we sold a cumulative total of about 750,000 books. Little self-published outfit. We were very proud of that, 750,000. 2020 hit, we sold 1.3 million books in 2020 alone. And that trend has continued in the subsequent years. So many families woke up and realized, what happened to my government? What happened to my country? How do I talk to my kids about what's going on? What we've really needed to realize, I think, is that we live in a country, the so-called land of the free, that is anything but for many people. And with the slightest of incidents, we can suddenly find ourselves no longer enjoying the freedoms that we often took for granted. I'm working on a book, actually, it's written, comes out in a couple weeks, called Children of the Collective. And the whole purpose of this book, I started working on this before COVID, was that when I was a young dad, I was a big fan of dystopian fiction. Anyone here like dystopian fiction? Am I the only one? I got a few fellow travelers. I really like dystopian fiction. Perhaps because, I watched the movie, The Patriot with Mel Gibson, and I cry. Because I'm like, it's all about freedom, or Braveheart, and all those typical movies, right? They really get me in my soul because that fight for freedom is just baked into my DNA. And I think that's why I like dystopian novels, is because they show the antithesis. They show quite the opposite, right? If we're not careful, here's what our society can devolve into. But as I was reading these books, I took special notice that in so many dystopian novels, they would present examples of families being utterly destroyed. So I wrote down a few notes. In the Giver, for example, as my son was just reading this last week, children were born to birth mothers who would never see their kids. The kids were instead raised in a nurturing center. In Anthem, which is Ayn Rand's novel, they had a time of mating every winter when all the couples would come together. Women would never see their kids would never know their parents, and this was the state of their society. Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, the children were manufactured in what were called state conditioning centers. Over and over and over again, I was recognizing this pattern in dystopian fiction that it was all about divorcing the connection between parent and child. It was about an authoritarian state intervening in a family relationship. And I didn't really understand why. A few years later, as I developed a real interest in history, long after all the social studies classes and the history classes that I got like C's in and never did a good job in school, never enjoyed history. But after college, I discovered a newfound interest in history, so I started reading a lot. And what I came to learn was that in collectivist societies, from time immemorial, that precise thing has happened. The authoritarian thugs have always gone after the kids. Always. So then I thought, okay, well, that's nice about history, but we live in America. We're a modern society. We're educated. We're past those times of, ignorance and oppression. That could never happen today. And boy, was I wrong. I came across a quote by Michael Novak a few years ago that really hit home for me on this issue. He says, "Between the omnipotent state and the naked individual looms the first line of resistance against totalitarianism. The economically and politically independent family, protecting the space within which free and independent individuals may receive the necessary years of nurture." Powerful, right? That quote stuck with me for a few years as I was reading all of this. And so this new book that I wrote, Children of the Collective, uses that quote by Novak and breaks it down bit by bit to understand how is the state omnipotent? How are individuals naked, proverbially speaking, How are families needing to be independent? And if they are, how can they best protect and nurture their young? So I want to spend a little bit of time with you this morning walking through each of those, because as I've had a few years throughout all of COVID writing this book to reflect on it, Novak's quote seems to me to be the formula. It has always been a struggle between an omnipotent state and the family. As families are strong, the state is weak. If families are weakened, the state grows. The state's progress and health and size and strength depends on weakening relationships between families. Right? As we can't take care of our kids or our grandparents and our aunts and uncles and ourselves, the state willingly comes forward and says, "Oh, I'll take care of you. Just surrender a little bit of your freedom, right? Just pay more taxes, right? And I'll take care of you." And over again, we fall into this progressive cycle where we delegate to the state our own care of ourselves and one another. There was a great book written a few years, decades ago by Bob Higgs called Crisis in Leviathan. And he chronicled how in decades past, especially during World War II, you would have these crises that would come on the scene, especially World War II, but certainly 9/11 or COVID or all these different encounters. And as a result of the crisis, whether real or imagined, the government would grow. Why? Because people get scared and they turn to the government and say, "Save me," and the state says, "I'll save you, and here's all these new programs." World War II is a great example because the government created all of these wartime departments. The Wartime Bureau of Economic Planning, right? And they're moving around all the rationed goods and making sure they can build their tanks and everything. Well, World War II ended. Did the government programs go away? None of them went away. They just renamed themselves. They were created for the sole purpose of this acute problem during war, but they persist. Ronald Reagan has that famous quote where he says, "The greatest thing to eternal life on earth is a government program," right? They just don't go away. And so this is the omnipotent state that we face. And we have to realize that if we cherish freedom, we need to strengthen our families. We need to strengthen one another's families because we are the first line of resistance. So how is the state omnipotent? Well, the state is omnipotent. Let's use another statistic. So we know what suicide is, right? Taking of your own life. We know what homicide is, taking of another's life. We know what genocide is, right? Taking of lives of a whole ethnic population. You ever heard of the term democide? Democide is the killing of an individual by his or her own government. Demo, right? Democracy. Democide. In the 20th century alone, over 262 million people were killed through democide. More than all the wars that all the American soldiers have ever been in and fought in and bled and died in. 262 million. The power of government is overwhelming, and it's not just for those who run afoul of the government and are incarcerated or killed in totalitarian societies. It can be as simple as your child suffering in a hospital. Such was the case with Alfie Evans in 2017. I don't know if anyone remembers this story, but he had a lot of brain damage, and the doctors said, we can do nothing for him. In fact, he's brain dead, and we don't think that he should be supported anymore. We need to just let nature take its course. The parents disagreed. The dad especially felt like his son was there and was slightly responsive. So they fought for Alfie. While the hospital in court tried to terminate the parental rights of Alfie's parents so that they could let Alfie die. It became an international scandal because they challenged through the court, and the courts kept knocking down the Evans mom and dad and say, nope, we're going to terminate your rights, we're going to let Alfie die. All the way up to the top court where they said, we're going to do this. Multiple countries stepped in, organizations came forward, we'll take care of him, we'll front the money, we'll provide care and comfort to the family, and the court refused and wouldn't let the family take Alfie. So if you're Stacia trying to have contact with her husband in the hospital through a glass wall during COVID, or if you're Alfie Evans' parents trying to preserve the life and the comfort of their young son for as long as possible, you suddenly realize that the power of the state is overwhelming. The state, in fact, considers itself the parent. There's a legal doctrine, Valerie would know this, called parens patriae. Comes from the Latin that means father of the nation. You see this especially in parenting cases when they're trying to terminate parental rights, but also in education cases. Homeschooling used to be illegal until just a few decades ago. Compulsory education laws forced kids to have to go to government schools, or if they were lucky, to private schools. And all of this stems from this legal fiction called parens patriae, where if the state thinks that you're an inadequate parent, like Alfie's parents, they will step in. The state will step in and be the parent that gets to decide the outcome of your child. They will decide what is in the best interests of your child. I think of China, certainly, with their one-child policy, right, that they had for a long time. The ability of the state to forcibly sterilize individuals, to forcibly abort babies because of this government edict. What's amazing about these edicts is that they shape society. For example, as a result of the one-child policy in China, women would routinely abort their babies if they were girls. It kind of makes sense why, right? If you only get one, you want to make sure that you can have more of an economic provider to be able to take care of you in your old age. You want a boy. And so now China is facing this massive population imbalance where they have an entire generation of boys and not enough, or men and not enough women. So then China relaxed it and they said, okay, we'll do 2. After years and years of this policy ruthlessly enforced, unless you were wealthy and connected, and then of course, those people can always skirt government policies, whether in China or in America. And so China relaxed their policy. They said, okay, you can do 2. What happened? Nothing. People have been so conditioned into having one child that they didn't really change their behavior significantly at all. The government is now struggling to get people to procreate. Elon Musk has talked about how, right, contrary to what a lot of fearmongers say, the risk is not overpopulation, it's underpopulation. That our population replacement level is dipping down below the level where we need just to sustain it. And the problem with all of this is the omnipotent state has attracted people to support it on the basis of a social safety net. We'll take care of you in your old age. Your kids can go off and do their own thing. We'll be the ones to take care of you, right? Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, and all these things. And the problem is that, like any socialist enterprise, it's a Ponzi scheme. I mean, that's literally what it is. The young people have to pay in to support the old people, and you always need an influx of young people. But if, like in China, the population of your younger generation is very small, it can't sustain a much larger, older generation. And so the state runs into problems to the point where in many European countries in recent years, they have literally bribed people to have babies. Not because they care about your family, Not because they want you to, have a joyous family full of children. They need taxpayers. For them, it's an investment. There's ROI, right? If we can encourage more people to procreate, then we'll get a tax benefit out of it. I read a book a few years ago. It's a phenomenal book called They Thought They Were Free by Milton Mayer. Mayer was a German Jewish American journalist during World War II. And he was very intrigued about how everything went down in Germany, his former country. As an American, he was appalled, he says, at what he saw happening in Germany. As a German, he was concerned. How did my countrymen come to this point in supporting all this, all these horrendous atrocities? And as a Jew, of course, he says he was just horrified at what was being done to his people. And as a journalist, he was curious. So he went over to Germany. And he interviewed a lot of people trying to understand, people of different walks of life, a baker, a mechanic, a politician, a teacher, right? Trying to understand how did it get to this point where you could support so much tyranny. It's a fascinating book. They thought they were free. He says in the book, in one of these interviews, actually one of the individuals he interviews basically says that every point was so incremental that you felt incapacitated, unable to speak out. If we had gone from point A to point Z in one fell swoop, we would have stood up, we would have spoken out. But we had become so habitually conditioned to the slow and incremental progress that we found ourselves deterred in speaking out, because if we're at point F and we see point G coming and all these new programs being instituted, because we didn't speak out on point E or D or C or B or A or even now, we've habituated ourselves into inaction. We're not speaking out because we've never spoken out, and everything is so incremental. Is that happening in America? Are we immune from that? I don't think so. So the omnipotent state. By contrast to the omnipotent state, we have the naked individual. Jean-Jacques Rousseau once said that man is born free, and everywhere he is in chains. We're born naked in a variety of ways, socially, physically, spiritually, intellectually. I want to share briefly this quote from Alexis de Tocqueville before we break each of those down. So de Tocqueville says, "Above this race of men stands an immense and tutelary power, which takes upon itself alone to secure their gratifications and to watch over their fate. That power is absolute, minute, regular, provident, and mild. It would be like the authority of a parent if, like that authority, its object was to prepare men for manhood. But it seeks, on the contrary, to keep them in perpetual childhood. For their happiness, such a government willingly labors, but it chooses to be the sole agent and the only arbiter of that happiness. It provides for their security, foresees and supplies their necessities, facilitates their pleasures, manages their principal concerns, directs their industry, regulates the descent of poverty, and subdivides their inheritances. What remains but to spare them all the care of thinking and all the trouble of living?" That is what we as individuals face with an omnipotent state. That is what our families face. De Tocqueville wrote this long before communism, long before the Soviet era, right? This was 250 years ago. This is a pattern since time immemorial. When you centralize power, men will oppress one another. Isaiah 3, "And the people shall be oppressed, everyone by another, and everyone by his neighbor." That is what the state does. That is what our families have to combat. But we're naked, we're unprepared. Physically, as one example, I shared last night in response to a question about how I became involved in politics. I run a think tank, we change laws, we do all these different legal and political things. But what got me involved was watching the news in 2007, when in Texas there was a raid at the Yearning for Zion property owned by the FLDS Church, a polygamous sect. Their leader, Warren Jeffs, was accused, rightly, of being a bad dude and marrying underage girls and all kinds of horrible things. But in the process, law enforcement legally kidnapped over 400 kids and forcibly separated them from their families, placed them in a foster care system that was rife with corruption and abuse and assault. I found that to be horrendous. I thought that was a massive civil liberties violations of these families, that they themselves and certainly their children were not suspected of any wrongdoing, and yet the state intervened and broke up those family connections. I had no clue what to do. I had never done anything before. I designed websites for a living. What did I know? So I designed an online petition, and I said, demand the release of these kids, and a lot of people shared it, and a lot of people signed it, and I got on the news, and I have that news clip to this day, and back before I had a beard, I looked like I was 13 years old. There I was on the news, fighting for these people. And it was to me the first inkling of how oppressive the government can be. I was raised in a conservative household. My mom was on city council. I was Republican, whatever that meant. Didn't really mean much, I just was. And I had really never had any run-ins with law enforcement. Well, I was an unruly teenager. There were a few stories, but nothing significant, certainly. And yet here I was watching this unfold, and I realized I thought I lived in America. How can that happen? I thought we were innocent until presumed guilty. I thought there was due process. I thought the Fourth Amendment required particularized suspicion, not just going in and scooping up 400 kids because you're concerned about one guy and what he's doing. And I realized the omnipotence of the state in that capacity, that we as individuals are physically naked. We are incapable of protecting ourselves. That's why self-defense lessons are so critical. The Second Amendment is not just about hunting animals, right? It's about throwing off an oppressive government. That if the Founding Fathers were not armed as they were, we would not have the country that we do today, or the country we once did that is slowly degrading, at least. Right? The Second Amendment is about protecting our freedom. It is about making sure that we can arm ourselves against that omnipotent state should it ever come to that. Fingers crossed it doesn't. But we're physically naked, especially our children. We're vulnerable. The state has immense power over us. And so we need to make sure that we're shoring up our physical nakedness. We're also socially naked. If you remember that story, you remember the term the Stockholm Syndrome? Remember where that came from? Patty Hearst was the granddaughter of William Randolph Hearst, the big publishing magnate, very successful guy. And she was kidnapped and brainwashed by the Symbionese Liberation Army. And they had all these grievances and all these demands. And at first they wanted ransom money for Patty, but Hearst wouldn't pay up. And so then they changed their tactic and said, oh, well, if you make a donation, to these people, then we'll release her. And for 2 months, they're brainwashing this gal to the point where she was helping them, Patty, build bombs and shoot at cops and go rob a bank, sharing messages saying, tell the brothers and the sisters that I love them and I'm standing with them in solidarity and all these things, right? She was brainwashed. And that type of thing happens today. I'll share later an example of this, that we are so subject to brainwashing that we don't even know it. Another book I'll recommend is by Edward Bernays. It's called Propaganda. It was written over a century ago. Bernays is what we would call the father of public relations, or the father of propaganda. He was the double nephew of Sigmund Freud, by birth and by marriage, and he was a student of the mind. But he was very connected into industry at the time and into the government as well. And so he became very involved in developing the early foundations of government propaganda. He wrote books on this. He was horrified, supposedly, years later, when the Nazis literally used Bernays' book as a guide for all of their propaganda activities in the Reich. So Bernays writes, I didn't mean for that to happen. I want it to happen in a good way, in an American way that will propagandize people. He had this one thing where one of his clients was a cigarette company. And I think it was Lucky Strike or one of these, and at the time, smoking was very fashionable for men, but not for the women. Well, the cigarette manufacturers wanted to make it fashionable for women, so they would double the market size for their product. They hire Edward Bernays, and he comes up with this concept that he would have these models female models walk in front of a parade, dressed as the Statue of Liberty, each of them, holding a lit cigarette in the air, calling them torches of freedom. And on that basis alone, public perception massively shifted, and it was perceived as cool for women to smoke, and from there, that began. He would lend his services quite often to the Wilson administration and World War I, and propagandizing the public through the limited PR abilities they had at the time to condition people to support war over and over again. I mean, do you know what false flag incidents are? During the Cuban, I'm a storyteller, I'm going off track, but I like telling stories. So during the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Joint Chiefs of Staff of the United States military went to the president at the time, it was JFK, and they proposed to assassinate American citizens and blame it on the Cubans so as to incite the American public to go to war against Cuba. Because at the time, polling showed that Americans didn't want to go to war. They said, we don't want it to go there. But the top military brass, who've sworn an oath, by the way, to uphold the Constitution and protect all of us, literally proposed in a formal document to the President of the United States to bomb American cities and to kill American citizens and manufacture the crisis, blame it all on the Cubans, so as to incite the public to go to war. And that stuff doesn't happen today, right? There's never any lying or deception, or there's no, conspiracy or coordination of activity. Fauci, hallowed be his name, is, without any blame or corruption or malincentives. But we're socially naked because we are highly manipulable. Edward Bernays, that individual I mentioned, I don't think I included his quote here. Oh, I did. Great. Here's his quote, one of many doozies in his book. The conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses is an important element in a democratic society. Those who manipulate this unseen mechanism of society constitute an invisible government, which is the true ruling power of our country. That was over a century ago. That was before the internet. That was before we had all these devices that we're literally programming our brains into. I will posit that the ability of propaganda for those in power is slightly more sophisticated than it was back then. And even back then, if Bernays was saying, this is the true ruling class, this is the invisible government when you can shape people's opinions and habits. What do we got going on today? We're spiritually naked. Mankind yearns for understanding and identity and purpose, and we find it often in our faith. But the state becomes a secular substitute with its own rituals and temples and ordinances and scripture. Rudy Giuliani once had this quote. He says, we're a religion, really, a secular religion. The state offers itself oftentimes as a substitute spiritually as well. Intellectually, Hannah Arendt is the foremost scholar on totalitarianism. And she has this quote, which is great. She says, the ideal subject, a subject in terms of someone who's under a ruling authority, the ideal subject for those who wish to rule is people for whom the distinction between fact and fiction no longer exists. When you have such an assault on truth, as we've seen today, when now it's in vogue to say, I'll speak my truth, you speak your truth, subjective morality, no right and wrong, you do you, I'll do me. What happens to a society that no longer has moorings of objective fact and truth that we can all commonly agree upon? Nothing good. Allen Dulles was the first civilian director of the CIA. And in 1953, he was at this conference where he was giving a speech on what he called brain warfare. He was warning the American public about what the Soviets are doing to intellectually condition the mind of individuals through various techniques. In that speech, he said, the aim of this Soviet program is to condition the mind so it no longer reacts on a free will or rational basis, but responds to impulses implanted from outside. If we are to counter this kind of warfare, we must understand the techniques the Soviet is adopting to control men's minds. The human mind is the most delicate of all instruments. It is so finely adjusted, so susceptible to the impact of outside influences, that it is proving a malleable tool in the hands of sinister men. We in the West are somewhat handicapped in brain warfare. It is hard for us to realize that in the great area behind the Iron Curtain, a vast experiment is underway to change men's minds, working on them continuously from youth to old age. What Dulles did not reveal, that's so the airport is named after him, that's where, if you've heard of that name before, What he did not reveal to his audience at the time was that he was overseeing a program in the CIA that was far more aggressive and significant in so-called brain warfare than anything the Soviets were doing. Project MK Ultra. Got a few nods in the audience. The records of which are mostly destroyed, but many have been preserved and then declassified. Through electroshock therapy and drugs and hypnosis and radiation, the American government was experimenting on individuals to try and figure out how to induce them to actions they otherwise would not do. This is literally what, so if you read Bernays about propaganda, propagandists have this term called engineered consent. They want to engineer the consent of the public, right? Declaration of Independence, government's just powers are derived from the consent of the governed. So the ruling class is always trying to figure out how can we engineer consent in the way that we want. Like with Operation Northwoods, which is the Cuban false flag example that I shared a moment ago, engineering consent by doing something that shifts public opinion in response and in favor to what you want to do. So there's engineering consent in a psychological context. There's also engineering of consent under Project MK Ultra with drugs and hypnosis and other things in a very physical and literal sense. The Inspector General, 4 years after Project MK Ultra launched, by the way, the Inspector General in theory is supposed to be overseeing government programs and limiting abuse and making sure people's rights aren't being violated. And after getting involved in this, here's what the Inspector General said. Precautions must be taken not only to protect operations from exposure to enemy forces, but also to conceal these activities from the American public in general. The knowledge that the agency, the CIA, is engaged in unethical and illicit activities would have serious repercussions in political and diplomatic circles and would be detrimental to the accomplishment of its mission. They argued at the time, in fact, that unwitting participants are desirable. That's in one of their documents. Their preference was for unsuspecting individuals that they could try this on. So much for consent. Okay, so we have an omnipotent state, and we have naked individuals, physically, socially, intellectually, spiritually. This is what we're up against in these two polar opposites. Where does the family come in? Well, in Novak's quote, he talks about the importance of family independence. And I think there's two criteria there. I think there's economic independence and political independence. If our families are not financially free, if we're not able to take care of ourselves, then we look to others. And in an atomized society where we're no longer living with multiple generations under one roof and really being able to support one another, too often we turn to the state, which is all too willing with an open arm to help us. I don't know if you remember during President Barack Obama's first campaign, he had this project called Life of Julia. And it was this slideshow basically showing this fictional girl, Julia, and how at every age of her life, she was taken care of by the government. That from a young age with all this, healthcare and early start and government-funded, kindergarten and public school, and later in life with Pell Grants and college, subsidized loans by the government and, getting on her healthcare and, later in life, Medicare, like all these things. And it was meant to say, we're here to take care of you. Vote for me. We're going to continue to support you at every stage. But you remember the signs at the zoo, right? Don't feed the animals. Well, why, right? It's because it would condition them to be dependent. And that's exactly what our government is doing to us. And so we have to be financially free. We have to have economic independence because that is what gives us freedom to act. Think of the founding fathers. Had they not, the various individuals who were delegates to that convention, had the financial capacity to abandon the farm and abandon the trade for weeks and months at a time, who would have been there in their place? That if they did not have the economic independence that afforded them the ability to focus on higher order things, if you're familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right, you got to satisfy those early wants before you can focus on, intellectual endeavors. Right? If we don't have those things taken care of, if we're not economically independent, we will not be free. We'll be at the mercy of others. So our families have to be economically independent, and I think you're going to be hearing a little bit about that today with some durable trades. Our families also need political independence. We have to recognize that society is going to be shaped in some form or another. The question is, how and by whom? Is society made up of closely knit families, interdependent, connecting one with another to support one another through what Alexis de Tocqueville called mediating institutions? When he came to America, remember he wrote Democracy in America? He was commissioned to come and tour this new country and say what gives, what's going on. He writes this 2-volume book, and he is blown away at what he called mediating institutions. He says, in Europe, if there's some kind of problem, everyone turns to the government and extends their hand out expecting something in return. But in America, that's not what happens. He said, everywhere you look, anytime there is a want or a need, individuals will form together an association or an enterprise of some type to supply the need or want that they want. He was talking about the voluntary association of a tightly knit society that would bring them together. So is society going to be arranged that way, or are we all going to be, on our phones, disconnected from one another, though we're increasingly digitally connected, not supporting one another, not, living with multiple generations, not living, having tightly knit communities, not knowing our neighbors, not taking care of one another? Because if we're atomized, we're more easily able to forge a relationship directly with the state, which is what it wants. So our families, without economic and political independence, will not be able to nurture our children. Well, what does that nurture look like? Recently, there was a group that got together, organized by the federal government, the Department of Education. They were called the National Commission on Excellence in Education. They spent 18 months going across the country, talking to teachers and students, reviewing curriculum, trying to ask and answer the question, how are the schools in America doing? How are we doing in educating our young? Let's make an assessment and see how we're doing. 18 months goes by, tons of public meetings all across the country, and in the end they produce a report. And in the report they say, among other things, that America's educational institutions are being submerged by a rising tide of mediocrity that threatens to overwhelm these institutions, and that further, if a foreign, unfriendly power, a government, had attempted to impose on America the very mediocre educational performance that now exists today, we might well have viewed it as an act of war. As it stands, they said, we've done this to ourselves. Now, I fibbed a little bit. This group did not recently do this. This was under the Reagan administration in 1983. Their report was called A Nation at Risk. The 40th anniversary is April 26th of this coming year. I'm working on a book called Mediocrity, 40 Ways That Government Schools Are Failing Our Kids, that we're going to publish on the exact day of the 40th anniversary to highlight just how bad things are. 40 years ago, we had a rising tide of mediocrity that threatened America's very institutions. Raise of hands in the audience. Anyone here think that the education performance of American schools have improved in the last 40 years? Bueller? Okay, no hands. No one brave enough to venture that opinion. This is what we're up against. The intentional dumbing down of American society. I would invite you, when you go home or later on your phones, Google, 8th grade test in the 1800s. There's a variety of them you can find online. I did this the other day for this mediocrity book that I was working on, so I was doing some research into it. And you remember that TV show? I don't know if it's still on. Are you smarter than a 5th grader? And they would have like an adult come and challenge a 5th grader based on 5th grade textbook questions. Well, are you smarter than an 8th grader? Not today with our massively dumbed down curriculum, but an 8th grader from a century and a half ago. I think all of us in this room, intellectual or otherwise, would struggle with the elevated quality of education that we used to have in America and versus the degraded quality that we have today. Put on my tinfoil hat for just a moment. I think this is intentional. If you're familiar with John Taylor Gatto, and if you're not, you got some homework to do. John Taylor Gatto, G-A-T-T-O. He was a 30-year public school teacher in New York. He was awarded New York City Teacher of the Year and then New York State Teacher of the Year by the establishment who gives out such awards. And in the very year that he got the New York State Teacher of the Year, he wrote an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal titled, "I Quit, I Think." in which he goes on to say that in his profession, try as though he did within the system to reform it. Try within his classroom to help kids and inspire kids and cultivate their curiosity. He says in the op-ed, I'm working within a system that hurts them more than it helps them. If anyone knows of a job where I can help kids without also hurting them, please let me know. And he quit. He went on to write many books, one of which is called Dumbing Us Down, The Hidden Curriculum of Compulsory Schooling. I read that book when I was engaged to my now wife, and it hit me upside the head because I realized this is intentional. There are people who architected the modern school system in exactly this way, to fashion people into a subordinate collective who are willing to follow orders and do what they're told and be part of the group rather than stand independently and think critically. Because people in power don't want critical thinkers. They don't want entrepreneurs. They don't want rugged individualists, because they can only enact control over a society full of sheep. Horace Mann, one of the early architects of the modern schooling movement, he was the founder of the common schools, which is the early precursor to today's public schools, once had this quote where he says, "Men are like cast iron, children are like wax." These individuals definitely saw, and most of them were socialists, they saw children to be manipulated, molded into the product that they wanted. When my wife and I built our home about a decade ago, we have a tiny little garden, 40 feet by 40 feet, and we're planting a whole bunch of stuff in the backyard. We had designed it all out. We had bought all the little tenderling, sapling, whatever they're called, at the nursery, and got all the water hooked up and spent all this time trying to make sure our garden would succeed. Planted everything, and it looked beautiful. I took a picture, I posted on Facebook. It became one of my top most liked photos at the time because people were like, wow, that's a cool garden. But man, it was high stress, because that was my first experiment beyond just a tiny little couple grow boxes at our previous house, where I realized that to nurture those young tenderling plants would require a significant investment of my time and attention and energy. Why? Because these plants faced so many threats that I didn't really adequately prepare for. Certainly the pests that just spontaneously emerge from the soil. I have no idea where all these pests come from. But even the wind. I live in an area where they have these windstorms coming through and just whip these little plants, and then 2/3 of them die. And so I had to go to great lengths to care for these plants. And I was right at the time of my life where my children were very young. So I started kind of comparing these two, that, okay, I'm nurturing plants. How am I doing this with my kids? My kids, like these plants, face a lot of threats. They face an omnipotent state that is trying to come after them, whether through the education system, or what I call the public fool system, or through other means and social media and influencers and authority figures and everything else, right? And I realized that just as I was trying to be intentional in caring for these plants, I had to exert great effort as it pertained to my children, to make sure that I was being very intentional and eyes wide open in understanding who and what the threats are. And I think that's one of our biggest problems. I think too few people understand what those threats are. Imagine you're on a literal battlefield in the Middle East, or wherever you want to imagine. And you're sent out there to go fight, except you don't have any body armor on. They didn't give you a helmet. You have a BB gun, and you have no idea where the enemy is or who it is. You're going to be a very ineffective soldier. That is the physical equivalent of the psychological reality that many of us suffer from. We don't know who the enemy exactly is. We don't know who our ideological opponents are. We don't have the proper armor and shield with which to defend ourselves against their attacks, because we don't understand the nature of those attacks, and we don't have very good weaponry to go on the offense. We will lose every battle that we don't even know is being fought. It's one thing to be ill-prepared. I think a bigger problem is that too many people don't even realize that we are in an ideological battle, that our children's minds are ground zero, and that we will lose every single battle if we don't wake up and protect them, if we don't nurture them, as Novak said, against an omnipotent state. I am one to use the term indoctrination in the typical sense. It's this pejorative, it's a negative, it's indoctrination. But the word itself isn't necessarily problematic. To indoctrinate is to teach the doctrine. It is to teach something, to propagate. I mean, even propaganda, it's the propagation of information. Just as society is going to be shaped one way or another, and the question is who is going to shape it and what's it going to look like, there will be indoctrination. Our children will be taught things. Their minds will be filled with ideas. The biggest problem I think we've faced as freedom lovers for generations is that we've delegated to institutions that largely despise us the upbringing of our children during their most intellectually formative years. Over 5 million kids in America are now being homeschooled across the country. We just hit that milestone recently, and I think that is an amazing trend that needs to continue because that is how we nurture our kids, and that is the basis of the resistance. My body, your body, is under a constant threat from pathogens. And our skin is actually an organ. It's the first line of resistance to actually shield us. There's actually some very cool, when I did the research on this, very cool science behind how our skin resists the pathogens that threaten us. But that if the pathogen gets into our bodies, there's our immune system and the mucus and all kinds of other things to try and ward off those pathogens. Novak's quote I found interesting because he didn't say the family is the only line of resistance. He said the family is the first line of resistance, much like our skin. There are weak families, there are broken families, there are single moms, there are orphans, and all the rest, right? We can't always have the perfect family, but it is the first line of resistance. The challenge for us is to make sure that those secondary lines of resistance and tertiary lines of resistance, the mediating institutions that de Tocqueville talked about, right? Our homeschool co-ops and our civic societies and our churches and our fraternal societies and everything else are sufficiently strong to care for one another. Because if we don't care for one another, if we don't care for our children, the state will try and do it for us. During the Hungarian Revolution, they threw off the Soviets because the Soviet presence in Hungary was very light. It was a light touch. They had some older tanks there. They weren't working very good. They didn't have a lot of soldiers. And a bunch of young adults and teenagers one day kind of sparked a revolution, built some Molotov cocktails on the fly, destroyed some tanks, shot soldiers, repelled them from Hungary. They were elated. They had a free government. They were suddenly self-organizing and trying to figure out how would they actually govern Hungary, until a week later when the Soviets returned with much bigger tanks and many more soldiers and crushed the opposition. Countless families fled, including the Hadjock family. They fled over to Austria across the bridge at Andau, and they made it to safety. And on the other side of the border, there were a lot of people there to interview all these refugees to try and learn their stories. And as the Hadjock family crossed over, the 13-year-old daughter, Vera, was very eager to chat. And she was very boldly talking about how the Soviets were awful and we wouldn't listen to them in class. They were teaching us this filth and we knew better. We knew not to pay. And the interviewers were stunned because so many of the kids had been subdued and propagandized and conditioned, right? Where the parents who believed in freedom were terrified to talk to their kids about what was going on for fear of the kid leaking it to another friend or to a teacher, and suddenly the parents are being hauled off to Siberia. And so parents were just paralyzed so often during this period of time to even talk to their kids, which means the state came after the kids and was able to propagandize them. And that's what these interviewers were mostly used to. But 13-year-old Vera was an anomaly. So they started talking to her, and they were blown away at how much she understood and stood for truth. So they turned to the mom. Mom, how is your 13-year-old daughter like this? She said, every night when the lights were out and the town was quiet, our family would go down into the cellar, we would read scripture, and we would wash the filth out of our children's minds that had been put in during that day. An intentional daily act, making sure to question what children were being exposed to, provide it context, correct it where necessary, and be engaged in the life of your child. That is the necessary nurture. And if we as families don't provide that first line of resistance, we face our children becoming part of the collective. We face our children having a better relationship or a deeper one with the state than with us. That is what we face. It's what freedom-loving individuals have faced for a very long time. And despite living in the land of the free and everyone pledging allegiance to the flag and everything being supposedly fine, it is not fine. COVID has revealed that when you peel back the layers of our government, there's a lot of filthy stuff going on. I think it's incumbent upon us as parents to make sure that we have eyes wide open about exactly what's happening so that we can protect our kids. That is the call to action, that intentionality that the Hadjock family had, making sure every day we're working with our kids to wash the filth out of their brains and make sure we can raise the next generation of freedom fighters. Thank you.
Thank you, Connor. Wow, guys, that was great.